Christ, and everybody said, you may be seated. Her name was April. Not that April. That would be a longer sermon. And April was a young woman whose path had crossed mine about 6 or 7 years ago. And to me, April was fascinating. She was fascinating. This girl was fascinating because of her realness, her genuineness, her upfront honesty about life. She was one of those no-nonsense type of girls, young gals. And I've really come across a lot of people in my life. But for some strange reason, out of all the people that I've come across, I am drawn to people like April. They're just very intriguing to me. And April was just April. I mean, every time you saw her, April was April. There was no show. There was no mask. Even after she found out I was a pastor, April continued to be April. I can't even tell you how many people are their normal selves. They find out I'm a pastor and all of a sudden everything cleans up. It's just keep talking. That's fine. April was April, and this is what I loved about her. Now, for some shocking reason, April decided to join a small group that I was leading at my house. And understand something, this is a young woman with no background in the church. She has no background with the scriptures. She comes to the home of a pastor and his wife. She's never been there before. And she joined up with a group that was open to everybody, but only guys signed up for the group. And so April is amongst all these guys. And so I'm figuring, man, she's going to give this 1 or 2 weeks. And then she's going to bail. And to be honest, I wouldn't blame her. She's amongst all these guys. But she stayed. Absolutely fascinating. And on one occasion, just a few minutes before our small group start, I grabbed a cup of coffee and I sat next to her near the table where all the other people were kind of gathered around. And I noticed she was drawing something on her sketch pad. And this is a sketch pad she took with her everywhere that she went. I never saw her without it. And as she was drawing, I looked over and I saw, her drawing was magnificent. I mean, this girl had some serious talent. And so then I asked her, hey, do you have any more drawings that I could see? And so she began to flip through her sketch pad all the way from the front to the back. And if I could use one word to kind of describe the essence of all of her drawings in that sketch pad, I would use the word dark. And I'm not talking about a color. Dark. Not a color, just dark. And so she keeps flipping through the sketch pad, and as she does, I keep picking up on this underlying kind of theme that's in all of her drawings. But then when we came across this one drawing, and this drawing wasn't on an actual page of her sketch pad, it was actually on a scrap piece of paper tucked in between the pages. And this is what she drew. Now, this may look a little graphic, but what you have here is a drawing of a heart. Most likely a human heart, okay? Not to scale, okay? So we come across this, and we just kind of stop, and I look at it, and here's what I know about art. Art comes from somewhere. Art is something that comes up and bubbles up from within us. I mean, art's inspired by people or situations or events or emotions. And when I looked at this heart on this piece of scrap paper, I knew that deep down there was something heavy inside of April that she was carrying around. And to create this with such vivid detail, nobody wakes up in the morning and says, I think I'll draw a picture of a heart with valves and a little blood. Have you done that? Because if you did, there's the door. No, I'm kidding. Just kidding. Now, you see, the more I got to know April, the more I got to learn different parts of her story. Over several years, I got to hear just different parts and different snippets. And the more I got to hear this, the more I began to realize that heart drawn on that sheet of scrap paper, that heart represented a story. That heart represented her life story, a life story that, from what I could tell, was marked by loneliness and abandonment and heartache and bottled up anger and sadness. But it was also a life story about her in rebellion and making these very destructive choices and these very kind of enacting, these very kind of giving into these sinful tendencies. This heart represented her life story. It was a dark story. It was a life story and it was a dark story. But here's what I would argue. I would argue that her life story is like all of our life stories. There is darkness in every single one of our stories. Because all of our stories, I would argue even more, are part of a much larger story. Part of a much larger story. And in some senses, your story and my story are all connected and intertwined, okay? The moment, we may think like the moment our story began was the moment we were conceived and then the moment we were born. But if we would put a different frame on things, I would argue that we all kind of walk within the same story. All of our stories are linked with each other's because our story also began when humanity's story began. And in the words of that hip-hop artist known as Drake, we all walk the same path, but we got on different shoes. Our humanity began. Our story began when humanity's story began. And so April's heart represents her own unique story, and it was a very dark one. But if we were to be straight up honest, we have shades of this darkness in our own lives. And it's not just from people that have kind of inflicted it or pushed it on us. We also have this darkness because of choices we've made. Because of really bad choices we've made. And unhealthy, sinful choices we've made. And it's also a darkness that we've invited into our lives. We've willingly invited this darkness into our lives, and now it's like all over the place in different shades. And this is what makes the scripture so powerful. The darkness that is in our lives, whether it's been inflicted on us or we've invited it into our lives, the same darkness that's there is the same darkness that's in here, from front to back. This is why the scriptures are so fascinating, and this is why they are so alluring. They draw us to them. Oftentimes, you can't get away from this story. There is a reason this has been the #1 bestseller in the world for thousands of years. Yes, because they had Time magazine back in the 1st century. Yes. Now, anyway, so what sets the Christian story apart from all other faith traditions and all other religions and all other philosophies is that it not only presents where this darkness originated and why this darkness continues to be present, but it also tells us something mind-blowing, something that people have debated and said, no way. It tells us the story of the divine, the creator, stepping into the darkness, feeling the weight of that dark story. God took that massive dark story on himself, and he felt the utter full weight of it. And here is the scandal, absolutely scandalous. He let that dark story crush him. He let it crush him. There's a German theologian. This is a great baby name, by the way. His name is Jürgen Moltmann. Baby name of the year, right there. Jürgen Moltmann. And Jürgen Moltmann wrote a profound theological work with a very profound title. The Crucified God. The Crucified God. Jesus crucified. God wrapped in flesh and blood, nailed to a cross by his own creation. That dark story crushed Jesus. That dark story that's been rolling on since the very beginning, that is yours and mine and everyone's, that story crushed Jesus. Crushed him. And he let it. And he let it. So, do me a favor. Turn with me in your Bibles to John chapter 20, verse 1. This is important. Bibles. John chapter 20, verse 1. Or scroll on your phone. John 20. Now what I want you to do, when you find it, put your finger there, bookmark it, use a used tissue, use your neighbor's finger, just put it there. Close the Bible, because we're going to read this in about 10 or 12 minutes. 10 or 12 minutes, give or take. And it's really important that we're already kind of keyed in. We got to get there really fast when I tell you to get there. Okay, so what we're about to read in a little bit comes out of John's Gospel. Now this is a passage, and this passage is out of John's Gospel, and John's Gospel is essentially this biographical type account of Jesus' life, understand that this is a 2,000-year-old ancient manuscript in here. It is a real document written by a real man named John who followed a real historical Jewish rabbi named Jesus in a real place called Israel. But what sets John apart from all the other writings that we have about Jesus is that he writes his gospel with another story that is playing itself out in the background, and you're going to see what I'm talking about in a minute. So check this out. This is how John starts his gospel. Some of you are very familiar with this. Some of you are sick of me putting this up here. I don't care. If you're not familiar, that's fine. But this is how John starts his gospel. And you're going to start to see the other story that comes alongside Jesus' story in his gospel. John starts with this. In the beginning was the Word, the Christ, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Now, if you are a faithful, devout, law-abiding Jew in the first century, when you would have read this text, it would have instantly brought you to one of the most foundational stories and one of the most foundational books in all of the Jewish scriptures. A book that we call Genesis. And Genesis begins like this. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So when someone would have read John's opening, all sorts of bells and whistles would have been going off. Now, two things about the book of Genesis. That word Genesis, translated in the Hebrew language, it means origins, it means beginnings. And so this is the beginning of where God created and ordered his world. This is the beginning of the world story. This is the beginning of humanity's story, which is your story. Second thing about the opening of Genesis. The creating and ordering took place over a 7-day period. Now, there's been lots of debate about this. Like 7 literal 24-hour days, or was it something else? And all sorts of debate. This is not the point the author is trying to make. He's not trying to prove it was 7 literal 24-hour days. The point is the number 7. 7 in Jewish consciousness was a number of wholeness. It was a number of completeness. It was a number that spoke of oneness with God. But here's what we know about that wholeness that existed in the beginning. What we know about that wholeness and that oneness with God is that took a very tragic turn. And suddenly things went very haywire. And if you look at the opening passages of Genesis, I mean, things just keep moving further and further away to the point where God grieves over the fact that he even created the world. That is how bad it got. And so things begin to spiral out of control when this turn takes place. And what happens is there is this deadly inertia that keeps building and building and building. And sooner or later, it's all going to come to a head. And it isn't going to be pretty. Now, this is a picture of my daughter from last year on our return flight home from Florida. This is her looking at that fold-out laminated evacuation procedures, oxygen mask usage, exit doors. Apparently she felt she really needed to kind of learn up on all of these procedures, and I'm glad she didn't know why. And I wasn't about to tell her, yeah, do your thing, read up on that, let me know how that works out. So anyway, I share this picture because I remember this flight very vividly. And I tell this story often. And I don't tell this story because Brooke asked a bajillion questions, because she does that all the time. I'm telling you the story because of what happened when we were landing, okay? Our plane had just touched down on the runway, okay? And as soon as the plane touched down on the runway, the brakes are on, and we're trying to slow down from that 140 or so mile an hour speed. There was then, as you hear these loud brakes, there was this sudden violent jolt, and it wasn't one of those bumps. I mean, it was, and you are grabbing for, I mean, it scared the daylights out. I mean, it was scary, and people are grabbing for stuff, anything they can hold on to. My wife slapped me. Anyway, and guess who's laughing the whole time? My daughter. Everyone is terrified for their lives, and she's laughing out loud. I mean, this was absolutely terrifying. And it was terrifying because you and I know that if that plane doesn't slow down, and if that plane kind of hits a bad angle, things aren't going to end well. And even as that plane touched down and the brakes were on and the jolt came, you also could feel the pilot hitting the brakes even more. It was like, oh no, okay? Hitting the brakes even more. And so all this inertia, I mean, we were just like going forward and people were grabbing onto seats. In the story of Genesis, there is this inertia that is building and building and building. And it is a dark story that we all know and live and experience and invite into our lives. And this dark story in Genesis is picking up more steam and more steam and more energy. And what we can tell is, man, things aren't going to end well. And so when John writes his gospel, this is where he begins to pick up. This is the story that he lines up with Jesus' life. And sooner or later, you know that that dark story that you and I live is going to smash head first into Jesus. So check this out. Follow me here, because this is where the jaw will drop. After John shares his opening passage, all right? He shares this story about Jesus going to a wedding in Cana in Galilee. And he takes his 12 disciples with him. Now the story gets dramatic, as it always does. And they begin to run out of wine at the wedding. It's not grape juice. They begin to run out of wine. And this would have been terribly embarrassing for the groom and his family. And so the master of the banquet, ironically, comes to Jesus' mother and says, we got a problem. And so Jesus, his mama, comes to him and says, Jesus, they are running out of wine. Reluctant at first, Jesus then goes to the servants and he says, I want you to fill up those 6 massive ceremonial jars with water. So they do it. And then at his command, they draw out the water out of these massive ceremonial jars, and they then give it to the master of the banquet, who drinks it, and he's absolutely floored. And he's floored because it is the choicest wine he has ever tasted. And the story ends with John saying this. Pay attention. What Jesus did here was the first of the signs through which he revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. Now, a couple chapters later, there is this government official that comes to Jesus, this man of extreme status and power. And this man of extreme status and power, all of that suddenly goes out the window, and he comes to Jesus and he says, my son is dying. And he's pretty much on the verge of death, like he is taking his last breath. Will you come with me and heal my son? But Jesus says to him, no. Go home. Your son will live. And the story goes that the very moment Jesus said that is the very moment that that young son was healed. And then John writes this. This was the second sign Jesus performed. So there is like a pattern developing here, okay? And what John is inviting us to do, he's inviting us to count. Begin to count. Because he no longer says things like this. Begin to count. So a few chapters later, Jesus heals this terribly disabled man who is lying next to this pool, totally neglected. Okay? A few chapters later, Jesus miraculously provides tons of fish and bread from only a few loaves and a few fish. Right after this, Jesus, in the midst of a violent storm, like you do, walks on water. After that, Jesus then goes and heals a blind man. And then a few chapters later, if that wasn't enough, he raises his friend Lazarus from the dead. So if you're counting from there, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. What other number is, where else is 7 found in the script? Creation. John is lining the creation story up with Jesus', he is paralleling these 7 signs with the 7 days of God's creation. And at the same time, Jesus has been running that dark story alongside Jesus' story. And it leads him all the way to the cross. But John's got one more sign. John's got one more sign. John chapter 20. Quick. If you haven't turned there, John chapter 20, verse 1. Early, on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. And so she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved, and said, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have put him." Now Mary, go to verse 11. Now Mary stood outside the tomb crying. And as she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb. She saw 2 angels in white seated where Jesus' body had been, one at the head and the other at the foot. And they asked her, "Woman, why are you crying?" "They have taken my Lord away," she said, "and I don't know where they have put him." And at this she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she didn't realize that it was Jesus. And he asked her, "Woman, why are you crying? Who is it you are looking for?" Thinking he was the gardener, she said, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will go get him." And Jesus said, "Mary." And she turned toward him and cried out in Aramaic, "Teacher." 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The raising of Lazarus, 7. This is the 8th sign. Because this is the 8th day. And this is a new day. This is a new story that has birthed forth in the midst of that old, dark, decaying story. This is a new day. You will notice in every single one of the Gospels it says early in the morning on the first day of the week. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, early in the morning on the first day of the week. Is that about time, or is that also about there is something brand new that has been born in this world? And Jesus is inviting us to get in on it. You don't have to keep living in that old, dark story, because all of that was defeated and taken care of at that cross. Are there brothers and sisters in here who are living by that old, dark story? Are there brothers and sisters in here who have invited that dark old story into your lives by the different destructive choices you have been making? Are there brothers and sisters in here who are just living by that old dark story of pain and betrayal and heartache and grief? You realize you don't have to keep living that old dark story that no longer has to dominate your life, because it's already been defeated. And now there are outstretched, nail-pierced hands inviting you to live a new story. So will you bow your heads with me in reverence?